Live everywhere on netrootsradio.com. David Waldman, Kagro, in the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? You hear me shuffling papers first thing in the morning. That was an interesting sound to wake up to. Good morning. It is Tuesday, August 8th. I better clean my glasses just to be sure. I look like August 9th there for a second, but no, it's Tuesday, August 8th, and it's time for another show. That much I can see fairly clearly, and it's already rolling. So that's the news for today, and that's where we stand. For those of you on the edge of your seats about yesterday's warning that it was National Take Your Kids for a Haircut Day, even though they're old enough to have driven themselves and really have scheduled the whole thing and taken care of it themselves, but they just don't do it because I still do it for them day. And I got to stop doing that. Okay, it's too much. But at any rate, yes, the haircuts went swimmingly. All good. New place, reluctant kids, growing their hair out and whatnot, so a little shy about a new place and a new stylist, but it all worked out very well. And yes, we drove, but yes, in the middle of terrible weather yesterday, the Washington, D.C. area and surrounding states, a bout of summer afternoon rainstorms, normal thing, but some incredible intensity in some places. And I understand that federal workers, actually the federal government in D.C. shut down early so that federal workers could head home early in advance of the storms. And in some places that was warranted. It was just a heavy downpour in our area, strong winds, etc. But in the immediate surroundings, trees down, power out, lightning strikes, the whole thing. And as a matter of fact, speaking of the weather, because it's time for a weather report, I did see this mentioned in the news roundups yesterday, and I didn't include it. But now that Scott Anderson has forwarded it to me, there's new and special reason to bring it up. Just sort of interesting, because it's a weather thing. It's a Scouts thing, and my kids were involved in Scouts as well. So just for those of you watching the planet roast, I guess, and keeping track of extreme weather events, the World Jamboree, the Scouts World Jamboree is underway. I think this happens every couple of years on a regular schedule. Maybe it's even 4 years like the Olympics or our presidential elections. I don't know. But World Scout Jamboree, Scouts are not just an American phenomenon, and they're, in fact, not even originally an American phenomenon, but there are scouting organizations in, nobody really knows how many countries around the world, and they all get together. There's jamborees. There are national jamborees, there's world jamborees, and all the scouts from all the different countries get together and hang out together and compare scouting notes. And it is happening happening in South Korea at the moment, because they're part of the world, and everybody decided to go there. And there is a tropical storm nearing the coast line there, where I guess they were all encamped for the World Jamboree, and it turns out they all have had to evacuate all of these poor scouts. I guess it's okay, and they're mobile because they were there camping out in tents anyway, but sometimes these World Jamboree sites are specially prepared with all sorts of fun stuff that I guess can't evacuate with them. I don't know, but that's the word, that a tropical storm expected to make landfall in Korea on Thursday means that beginning yesterday, I guess, since I thought I saw this mentioned yesterday, the scouts are moving inland. So, too bad. Sounds difficult, and apparently noting that the World Jamboree had already struggled with heat, hygiene, and land use controversies, which, that's a pretty good general description of Scouts summer camp anyway, even here in the United States. So, I guess it's a familiar issue. Anyway, just more extreme weather events to keep an eye on. Not the main focus of what we'll be doing here today. And even that still under consideration. I guess the other housekeeping news is I have been convinced to use an invitation to Blue Sky, which I wasn't going to do because, I already started using Mastodon, and, despite the fact that it's fairly different from Twitter, it has a very different feel and composition and all of that. I guess I was just sort of done with the Twitter scene, or at least I didn't want to post on more than one of these social media sites. I wanted to sort of concentrate on one and only one, because it's annoying, and it's annoying to cross-post the things or hold two different conversations in two different places or monitor them all. But Blue Sky is out there, and it's proving fairly popular among the people that I used to follow and depend on, follow on Twitter and depend on for inputs as information for this show, not the listeners who I still have been able to connect with via Mastodon. And, I haven't deleted my X Twitter account. Some people advocate for that. I just have been mostly not posting there and trying not to contribute any content. So I was glad to see Blue Sky open, even though it violates all the principles here. Like, it's the same. Not only is it a privately owned, billionaire-owned social media platform, which, as we've seen from Elon Musk's ownership of Twitter, can be a huge problem. It's owned by the same guy who made the huge mistake of selling Twitter to Elon Musk, and who knows what he's going to do with this one. And I suppose it would serve us all right to find out, what a disaster Elon Musk is for Twitter, and he comes in and destroys it, and everybody has these weird theories about whether or not he ever intended to make a profit with Twitter or just simply wanted to destroy it. And nobody's asking questions. I mean, maybe with good reason. There may be no foundation whatsoever for asking this question. But nobody's asking whether Jack Dorsey really wants to found sound, long-lasting, robust social media platforms, or just wants to sucker people into believing they've found a new one and joining it and investing themselves and their time in it, only to sell that one to Elon Musk too. I mean, right now, he's 1 for 1 on selling that stuff to Elon Musk. We'll see what happens with this next one. So anyway, but I took an offer to take an invitation and run with it. That was the other drawback of the whole thing, was that it was at least initially by invitation only, I believe, right? That's how they were working it. And I guess it's still in that stage. Although, I don't know, I guess if you're on there for a certain amount of time, they just start giving you invitations to hand out. It's an interesting, word of mouth distribution sort of thing. But I want to thank Joe Gannon, who had emailed some time ago offering a Blue Sky invite, because saying, I've been a longtime listener and supporter, and he says, I was almost sobbing hearing how you and Greg had been left out. We were okay with it, but it was nice of you. And he offered up a Blue Sky invite, but I didn't use it right away. And I was delinquent in doing it. I was dragging my feet, trying to decide whether I really wanted to be a part of it or not. And then the other day, Joan from Vacation Land, likewise chimed in and wrote a nice offer saying, hey, do you need a Blue Sky invite? Here's one. And I said, I already have one, and I haven't decided to use it or not. So maybe you want to give that one away to somebody. But, I was like, well, Joan's there. And then as it turns out, a lot of the people, like I said, that I followed and loved to converse with, but was missing from Twitter, only some of them had come over to Mastodon, and those that did hadn't really engaged there in the same way. But they were all at Blue Sky and blabbing happily. And so I thought, all right, maybe I'll give it a try and I'll sign up. At least I'll go and grab my username so no one else does. Not that anybody's in any rush to steal my username. But then, Joe, it turns out that those things actually expire. I didn't think about that. So it wouldn't connect. So I apologize for not using it fast enough and wasting it when you could have given it to somebody else. And then Joan bailed me out and said, well, here, try this one. So I got it. So the two of you together have moved me to Blue Sky. And, it looks really nice, and it's understandable for Twitter denizens. And now, though, I have my email open. I got Mastodon open. I got X open. I got blue sky open, so now it's even harder for me to remember to flip back and forth between them and pick up messages from, but we'll see how it all works out. That's my grousing for the day. Donald Trump is still grousing because he's still under indictment in 3 different cases and getting set to, for a 4th. Georgia apparently laying the groundwork. I believe they've begun closing the streets around the courtroom there, and in anticipation of announcing the 4th indictment against Donald Trump. Possibly, as Greg explained, later in the week. Nobody's really sure, but that's coming up. And so with another indictment set to get on the pile and litigation and motion practice already beginning on the January 6th indictments, the most recent indictments, we really have to make a decision whether or not we're going to go through the rest of that indictment or not. And my feeling is yes. Again, I know it must be tiring at some point, but I think this is the most consequential of the indictments so far, although I'll be very interested to see what the Georgia one has to say. The Mar-a-Lago documents case is consequential in a very different sort of a way, i.e. you really shouldn't have a person being president and stealing confidential, or rather classified documents and doing God knows what with them. But maybe that one would heat up a bit if they found out what he had been doing with the documents and whether he had made any sales or targeted leaks of the documents or not, besides waving them around and telling people what an important person he was. But we'll wait and see. But this one, of course, alleges a very direct kind of a crime against the United States. And while it's still a crime against the United States to threaten its national security by threatening the security of its classified information, the victim in this crime is a little less material here, whereas it's a little bit better understood, in my view, who the victims are, even if it is all of us in the January 6th case. So at any rate, I have that indictment open, and I still have my notes about where we left off. So we're getting there. And as I recall, my note is to start at paragraph 96, and where there are 130 paragraphs. So we're getting there. And the last couple of paragraphs are really just actually recitations of the charges themselves. So we might actually, if we apply ourselves, get through this. So like I said, we were going to start at 96, which means that we had ended in 95. 95 is, it's most of the way through this section on the defendant's attempts to enlist the vice president to fraudulently alter the election results at the January 6th certification proceedings. So this has to do with the pressure on Pence, which is relevant to today's news in particular because, of course, it's starting to sound like Pence is going to show up as a witness against Trump at the trial, whenever this trial takes place. We have, of course, the word about the contemporaneous notes, and I have to note again, as I observed yesterday, Pence says that that his notes, first of all, that they're contemporaneous, and the law allows for those kind of contemporaneous notes to be admitted into evidence even where they might otherwise be considered hearsay. It's a hearsay exception if you have those if they're contemporaneous notes. You can't necessarily just scroll them down months later and say, I recall that he said this thing. That doesn't count in the same way as keeping contemporaneous notes, for various reasons, but the recollection is fresher. It's not entirely clear that it's against any one person's interest at that point. There's no case against them, so the motivation for keeping those notes is somewhat less suspect, et cetera, et cetera. But it was also of note yesterday that contemporaneously, those contemporaneous notes were scrawled on his calendar. Apparently that's his methodology of taking notes. Interesting in its own right, but also interesting because apparently it was a way of deflecting comment or concern or supervision from Trump, who would otherwise, I guess, try to stop him from taking notes. He could say, I'm just making a note on my calendar. But also because surely there will be Trump defenders who say, we can't believe these notes. He's a witness. He's a hostile witness. It's a witness against Trump. Why should we believe what he has written on his calendar? And I reminded you that notes written on a calendar, or notes not written on a calendar even, are absolutely determinative when it comes to Republican storytelling, at least in the case of Brett Kavanaugh, who was able to say that the accusations being made against me are categorically false thanks to the notes, my contemporaneous notes on my calendar from 1983. So this calendar, logically speaking, you would have to give the same credence to Mike Pence's calendar that you did to Brett Kavanaugh's. After all, they're both Republicans, but somehow one will count for a lot less, I think, in their opinion when push comes to shove. Okay. So that is I was going to say that this section of the indictment is of some interest because now there's litigate or motion practice going on in the January 6th case, because the judge in the case has rightly been convinced by the DOJ lawyers that there's a long-standing pattern with Trump, especially when involved in litigation, of his launching personal attacks against people making accusations against him or people who are going to even appear as witnesses at trial against him. And they wanted to prevent that from happening, and it's a long-standing practice of federal courts to say, defendant can't spend the time between now and trial while released on his own recognizance or on bail or whatever the case may be, to attack the witnesses or to send mobs to their homes or encourage people to issue death threats to those witnesses. That's a problem. We seek to prevent that. And the DOJ would like to have an order in place so that if he begins doing that, which he already has, they argue, they can actually do something about it. But again, that in the news because he's in the middle of doing that. And this section of the indictment is about the beginning of Donald Trump's terror campaign against Mike Pence and attempting to get him to do his bidding in the January 6th proceedings and finding only frustration. And then at some point resorting to turning the crowd against him and having them chant, hang Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence. And Trump sort of just watching it all happen on television. So let's see. I'll just go back one paragraph to set the scene here. Paragraph 95. We're on the morning of January 5th. At this point, at the defendant, Trump's direction, the vice president's chief of staff and vice president's counsel met again with co-conspirator 2. Again, that's Eastman. Co-conspirator 2 now advocated that the vice president do what the defendant had said he preferred the day before, unilaterally reject electors from the targeted states. Just bring down the gavel and say, we're not counting your electors. No reason. And no vote either. I just say these electors are no good. Eastman, a lawyer, says this is doable and you should try it. During the meeting, co-conspirator 2 privately acknowledged to the vice president's counsel that he hoped to prevent judicial review of his proposal because he understood that it would be unanimously rejected by the Supreme Court. So hopefully we won't have any court review of this. But he may also have been saying, I think I might succeed in avoiding judicial review of this plan under the political question doctrine. But if they were to take the case, they would almost certainly say, no, there's no authority whatsoever for what you advocate. The vice president's counsel expressed to co-conspirator 2 that following through with the proposal would result in a disastrous situation where the election might have to be decided in the streets. Another reference to violence, though not from the Trump side, but rather from Pence's side, saying this thing you propose will result in violence, or is very likely to result in violence. But apparently that didn't bother co-conspirator 2 or 1 or 3, 4, or 5, not 6, and not the defendant themselves. So, paragraph 96, that same day, January 5th, The defendant encouraged supporters to travel to Washington on January 6th, the next day, and he set the false expectation that the vice president had the authority to and might use his ceremonial role at the certification proceeding to reverse the election outcome in the defendant's favor, including issuing the following tweets. At 11:06 a.m., quote, "The vice president has the power to reject fraudulently chosen electors." This was within 40 minutes of the defendant's earlier reminder, "See you in D.C." At 5:05 p.m., again January 5th, Washington is being inundated with people who don't want to see an election victory stolen. Our country has had enough. They won't take it anymore. We hear you and love you from the Oval Office. And C, at 5:43 p.m., "I will be speaking at the Save America rally tomorrow on the Ellipse at 11 a.m. Eastern. Arrive early. Doors open at 7 a.m. Eastern. Big crowds." Of course, it was an outdoor event. The doors open. If the doors open at all, it's because people were exiting on their way outdoors to this outdoor event. There were no doors, but there were magnetometers. And that actually, we learned from news reports earlier, annoyed Trump to no end, and he wanted the magnetometers taken away, knowing full well and in fact acknowledging that they may very well be armed at his rally, but that's okay because they're not here to hurt me. It's all right if they carry weapons around D.C. and hurt other people because those other people aren't me. And I guess that was the reasoning. And, I mean, that also, of course, brings us to, the thing we've been talking about since forever, that while there was a full-blown violent riot happening at the Capitol building in the United States is under siege, and there's no additional security measures taken at all that anybody takes any notes of contemporaneously or otherwise at the White House, which is all the evidence you really need to infer the correct conclusion that Donald Trump wasn't afraid and no one around him who was responsible for his safety was afraid for his safety because those violent protesters were being directed by Trump. He wasn't going to direct them at himself, so there was no need for any additional security or any additional measures to be taken at the White House. And the contemporaneous notes of the pool reporters there bear that out, that it was a normal day. Basically, it was, busy. People were talking and rushing about, but no additional security measures taken at the White House while the U.S. Capitol is under violent siege a mile away because the person directing the violence was in the White House and wasn't going to direct it at himself. That's why there was no need for any additional security measures. All right. Paragraph 97. Also on January 5th, the defendant met alone with the vice president. When the vice president refused to agree to the defendant's request that he obstruct the certification, the defendant grew frustrated and told the vice president that the defendant would have to publicly criticize him, which of course he's supposed to be barred from doing right now. That's why, again, it makes it in the news. Upon learning of this, the vice president's chief of staff was concerned for the vice president's safety and alerted the head of the vice president's Secret Service detail. That's an extraordinary thing to have to do as the chief of staff of the vice president, to talk to his Secret Service detail and say, I understand I'm telling you that there's a credible threat against his safety. Where's it coming from? The president. That is unusual, and I wonder how they might have reacted to that. He probably didn't blurt it out in just so many words, but that's what he meant. Paragraph 98. As crowds began to gather in Washington and were audible from the Oval Office, the defendant remarked to advisors that the crowd the following day, on January 6th, was going to be, quote, angry. That night, the defendant approved and caused the defendant's campaign to issue a public statement that the defendant knew from his meeting with the vice president only hours earlier was false. It was, the vice president and I are in total agreement that the vice president has the power to act. He does not have the power to act, and they were in total disagreement. Paragraph 100. On January 6th, starting in the early morning hours, we finally made it to January 6th here, the defendant again turned to knowingly false statements aimed at pressuring the vice president to fraudulently alter the election outcome and raised publicly the false expectation that the vice president might do so. At 1 a.m., this is subparagraph A. At 1 a.m., the defendant issued a tweet that falsely claimed, if Vice President Mike Pence comes through for us, we will win the presidency. Many states want to decertify the mistake they made in certifying incorrect and even fraudulent numbers in the process not approved by their state legislatures, which it must be. Mike can send it back, but you see, there's some reference to the earlier legalistic theory that was raised in federal court in Wisconsin and soundly defeated. The idea we discussed extensively on the show, which was that their reading of the clause in the Constitution that gives the state legislatures the power to decide how to determine the selection of their electors in the Electoral College, that meant that anything that had to do with the way that selection was conducted had to be dictated directly from the state legislature and couldn't be delegated to other lesser authorities like boards of election or other election oversight bodies. Oh, I'm way behind on their music here, so I'll have to keep an eye on that and get out of here on time. But where the federal courts found, as we did, that no, it was really kind of only saying, well, you decide by what method you'll choose your electors, whether it will be by a popular vote in your state or whether they'll be named by the state legislature or whatever, but you choose and stick with it, and that's it.
Sup fam, it's your boy Darwin, aka Darwin_Darko, aka the most reasonable man in America, aka KITM's senior black correspondent. You might remember me from such recordings as Spacemen vs. Space Cadets and We Need to Talk About Joe Biden. Today, I want to bring you good news about that thing you've been struggling with. Do you suffer from giving too much of a damn? Do you turn on the series of tubes and find yourself outraged at the particular way some news organization strung some sentences together only to realize, nope, this is not some fictional hellscape? Well, guess what? You no longer have to accept the life of giving too much of a damn. You can do something about it, because even you, yes you, can be a show contributor. Now I know what you're thinking. Hey, Mr. Most Reasonable Man in America, I'm not some professional podcast talking guy. Don't worry about it. Do you have a smartphone or some other electronic recording device? Well, that's all you need. You too can have a segment where you can read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Fair warning though, side effects may include general punditry, having opinions and hot takes, getting stuff off your chest, and hearing your own voice. If your recording lasts longer than 5 to 7 minutes, please consult kagrox@gmail.com. That's KAGROX@gmail.com.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. I know we've come back in a weird place in the music, just as we left at a weird place in the music, but we have the time right, I think. All right, as we left, we were saying that this first tweet that's offered up in the indictment under paragraph 100 to demonstrate that the defendant, Donald Trump, on January 6th began again turning to knowingly false statements aimed at pressuring Pence to fraudulently alter the election results or the outcome of the election. He begins by citing the loser of a case, the discredited theory that only a state legislature can set any rule that has anything to do with how an election is held. Like, for instance, when the polls open or close, or whether or not you're allowed to park in this area or that area, or how close you could be to a polling place with a sign, any and all of the rules regarding how an election is conducted must come directly from the state legislature. That is not true. and that the clause in the Constitution that gives the legislature the right to choose how its state's electors will be chosen not only allows you to choose that methodology once, but to choose it as many times as you want, even if the contest has already been held. Remember, it was their theory that, well, yes, we've held a popular election in the state and decided ahead of time that that would determine who the electors would be. But you can change your mind after the fact and say, well, the election went poorly or fraudulently or some other adjective that somehow justifies our taking it all back and asking for a do-over, and that the do-over isn't another election, but us just appointing a new slate of electors. That, too, turns out not to be true, because it sounds pretty stupid and crazy on its face, and most Americans would say, no, you make your decision and you live with it. But anyway, so that was part of his tweet, his first tweet from January 6th at 1 a.m. when maybe he should be getting some sleep. Paragraph B here, subparagraph B, says that at 8:17, the defendant issued a tweet that falsely stated, states want to correct their votes, which they now know were based on irregularities and fraud, plus corrupt process, never received legislative approval. All Mike Pence has to do is send them back to the states, and we win. Do it, Mike. This is a time for extreme courage. And again, a reference to the defeated theory destroyed in federal court in Wisconsin and pretty much everywhere else it was ever discussed. Just one extra bit of nuance to that was that he was saying here the unstated theory behind this tweet was essentially that the COVID precautions, the COVID protocols adopted for the conduct of this election included, of course, you'll recall, the use of drop boxes for ballots so that there could be, if not entirely contactless, less contact involved in dropping off ballots, casting votes, and that you could drop your ballot in the mail and send it, but you could also drop it a few days before the election and even up to Election Day in a drop box, so it wouldn't have to go through the mail system, which you'll also remember that Trump and his Postmaster General were suspected of possibly monkeying with and screwing around with so that certain votes could be suppressed, so people had their suspicions. But the drop boxes, again, the theory goes, that's a method of conducting an election that had been authorized by some nobody from out of left field, i.e. the boards of election or the secretaries of state of these various states, said, we will provide secure methods for you to deposit your ballots on account of COVID-19 and the extraordinary circumstances. And it was the Republican theory that because the state legislature in some cases had not specifically authorized the use of drop boxes, or even in cases where they had already previously authorized the use of drop boxes because they weren't invented for COVID. There were some states that used them. They just were put in more widespread use because of COVID. But in states where they had authorized the use of drop boxes, in some cases, the drop boxes were open 24 hours in some cases and monitored, but in some cases were only open certain hours, but maybe expanded hours. But the legislature didn't expand the hours, or the legislature said that you could have drop boxes, but it didn't say you could have 68 of them. It didn't give you a number. So therefore the whole thing is invalid and you should throw out the results. And Mike Pence, because, I don't know, picking one out of a hat, because Utah authorized the use of drop boxes but didn't specify how many on which street corners they should be and what color they should be painted. The Constitution says that's illegal, and Mike Pence can decide to just throw it all in the garbage because of the wrong color paint. That was the basic argument being made. Now, moving on, paragraph 101, on the morning of January 6th. It's getting close here. An agent of the defendant, you have to figure out who this is. An agent of the defendant contacted a United States senator to ask him to hand-deliver documents to the vice president. The agent then facilitated the receipt by the senator's staff of the fraudulent certificates signed by the defendant's fraudulent electors in Michigan and Wisconsin, which were believed not to have been delivered to the vice president or archivist by mail. We should add at this point, they have not been delivered by mail as required in the Electoral Count Act. That's part of the requirement there. And they had, to this point, attempted, I guess, to mimic the process and procedure outlined in the Electoral Count Act in the hopes that they would then, therefore be considered at least as valid as the real electoral votes. The things that they were missing, of course, the certificate of ascertainment, the signatures of the proper authorities from the state that the electoral votes were supposedly coming from. Then, of course, having not been sent by mail to the places they were supposed to go and instead being hand-delivered by some goofball. Now, the some goofball that they recruited, the senator I think they're talking about here, is Ron Johnson of Wisconsin. There's a whole news story out there, and I know we have in the archives some of the reporting about it that will tell us who the agents were. Definitely some names I don't remember, but also, as I recall, Scott Perry, who's, when they say an agent of the defendant, I don't think they're referring to Scott Perry because he's a congressman in his own right and wouldn't necessarily, he may count himself as an agent of Donald Trump for all I know. But there was definitely some staff people involved in that too. So I don't know exactly who they're talking to or talking about, but yes, it was Ron Johnson. They tried to get to hand deliver these things to Pence. When one of the senator's staffers contacted a staffer for the vice president by text message to arrange for delivery of what the senator's staffer had been told were alternate slates of electors for Michigan and Wisconsin because the archivist didn't receive them. And, of course, they wouldn't receive them because the archivist does not receive alternate slates of electors, usually. But, as it turns out, that has happened. So it's not, automatically disqualifying, necessarily, of these slates. But that's what they were told. You got to deliver these to the vice president because the archivist didn't receive them. So it's a little ambiguous exactly what they mean and all of that. But either way, it's outside of the normal procedure. Once they were told that, the vice president's staffer rejected them. There was a do not give these to him, right? The wording was something like this: do not attempt to do this. We don't want anything to do with it. This is bogus, counterfeit stuff, and we don't want anything to do with it. Paragraph 102, at 11:15 a.m., it's getting close to the time here, the defendant called the vice president and again pressured him to fraudulently reject or return Biden's legitimate electoral votes. The vice president again refused. Immediately after the call, the defendant decided to single out the vice president in public remarks that he would make within the hour, reinserting language that he had personally drafted earlier that morning, falsely claiming that the vice president had authority to send electoral votes to the states, but that advisors had previously successfully advocated be removed. Very interesting, and laying the culpability right where it belongs, at the feet of Donald Trump, the defendant himself. And again, this is relevant to today's news because part of the motions being made about restricting Trump's ability to speak about the case and about people, parties to the case, witnesses, etc., is they'll be fighting that out in front of the judge, and prosecutors will be pointing to incidents like this. They already have in their paperwork pointed to incidents like this and said that the defendant has a demonstrated history. Half the theory of the case is that the defendant won't stop trying to intimidate witnesses or intimidate this particular witness in particular by name in public all the time. And it has already led to death threats against this person that the Secret Service detail took seriously enough that they spent a frenzied number of hours later on January 6th hiding him in a secure location for fear of assaults or attempts on his life. So, maybe you could take that into account, Judge, and it looks like she probably will. Paragraph 103. Earlier that morning, the defendant had selected co-conspirator 2, Eastman, to join co-conspirator 1, Rudy, in giving public remarks before his own. When they did so, based on knowingly false election fraud claims, co-conspirator 1 and co-conspirator 2 intensified pressure on the vice president to fraudulently obstruct the election or the certification proceeding. A, co-conspirator 1, Rudy, told the crowd that the vice president could, quote, cast the ECA aside and unilaterally decide on the validity of these crooked ballots. He also lied when he claimed to have letters from 5 legislatures begging us to send the electors' slates to the legislatures for review, and called for, and this is not great when it comes to advocating for violence, trial by combat. Rudy Giuliani, you're calling for violence. Combat, in fact. And that the legal issues here really should be settled by who can kill who. Or whom, I suppose, after. Okay. Well, all right. So that's another call for, or admission that ultimately this all resolves itself via violence. It all rests on at least the credible threat of violence. So that's 3 of the co-conspirators, I think. Clark, Rudy, and Eastman, who at some point in the course of what's alleged in this indictment make explicit or implicit threats that, or admissions really, that, yeah, at bottom, the last goalpost, after we've moved it 100 times, if it just doesn't work, we'll just, well, it all comes down to violence. And we have the violent people in place thanks to the communications from the president. He's handpicked who he wants to commit this violence and has called them to Washington to do so. And keeps reminding us in the run-up to the moment of truth, I have violent people here in D.C. who are angry and blame you. You better do what I ask you to do, or I can't be responsible for what happens. Of course, though, he actually already was responsible for what was about to happen. Paragraph B, and remember here, this is co-conspirators 1 and 2 intensifying pressure on Pence. Co-conspirator 2 told the crowd, all we are demanding of Vice President Pence is this afternoon at 1 o'clock, he let the legislatures of the states look into this so we get to the bottom of it and the American people know whether we have control of the direction of government or not. We no longer live in a self-governing republic if we can't get the answer to this question, except that there was no question. Everybody who had already looked at the question not only agreed that there was no fraud or nothing in dispute, but that there really was no question involved. They were really, literally just asking questions for the sake of making it look like there were questions. But the court had answered the question and indeed had answered the question of whether there was a true question or not. There wasn't. Paragraph 104. Next, beginning at 11:56 a.m. That's about an hour and 4 minutes there before the time appointed for counting the electoral votes. So beginning at 11:56 a.m., the defendant made multiple knowingly false statements integral to his criminal plan to defeat the federal government function, obstruct the certification, and interfere with the rights or others' rights to vote and have their votes counted. The defendant repeated false claims of election fraud, gave false hope that the vice president might change the election outcome, and directed the crowd in front of him, right in front of him, to go to the Capitol, to set them on foot, as it were, to go to the Capitol as a means to obstruct the certification and pressure the vice president to fraudulently obstruct the certification. The defendant's knowingly false statements for these purposes included: A, the defendant falsely claimed that based on fraud, the vice president could alter the outcome of the election results, stating, one more time, I hope Mike is going to do the right thing. I hope so. I hope so. Because if Mike Pence does the right thing, we win the election. All he has to do, this is from the number one, or certainly one of the top constitutional lawyers in the country. He has the absolute right to do it. He's talking about Eastman, of course, who's terrible. We're supposed to protect our country, support our Constitution, and protect our Constitution. States want to revote. Well, there's no provision for that. Sorry, go away, get lost. The states got defrauded. They were given false information. He's giving false information. They voted on it. Now they want to recertify. They want it back. All Vice President Pence has to do is send it back to the states to recertify, and we become president, and you are the happiest people. And B, after the defendant falsely stated that the Pennsylvania legislature specifically wanted, quote, to recertify their votes. They want to recertify. But the only way that can happen is if Mike Pence agrees to send it back. The crowd began to chant, send it back. C, the defendant also said that regular rules no longer applied, stating, and fraud breaks up everything, doesn't it? When you catch somebody in a fraud, you're allowed to go by very different rules, which, in another country might have come back to haunt him. Like we were catching him in a fraud. Maybe the rules are that he gets arrested, hands bound behind his back, and is machine gunned in the Rayburn Horseshoe on January 7th. That could be the rule. The rules could go out the window. We don't know. But it's interesting that, when he thinks he's got other people caught dead to rights, he's looking for them to rightly be dead. But catch him dead to rights, well, First Amendment, something. It's aspirational, and I have a right to do it. Rather amazing. One of the most crystalline examples of gimmitarianism ever. Although I think I have actually said that very phrase 5 or 6 times, but it all has to do with him. All right, let's see. The note here, by the way, from Charlie Savage is that these remarks and the ones in the next subparagraph by Trump have widely been characterized as incitement, but Smith singles them out and does not actually bring the charge of incitement at this point. Maybe never, but not at this point. Then subparagraph D, finally, after exhorting that we fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. The defendant directed the people in front of him to head to the Capitol, suggested he was going with them, and told them to give members of Congress the kind of pride and boldness that they need to take back our country. Woo! And then paragraph 105, during and after the defendant's remarks, thousands of people marched toward the Capitol. It's just laid out there alone as paragraph 105. That's a fact. Next section, the defendant's exploitation of the violence and chaos at the Capitol begins with paragraph 106. Shortly before 1 p.m., the vice president issued a public statement explaining that his role as president of the Senate at the certification proceeding was about to begin, did not include unilateral authority to determine which electoral votes should be counted and which should not. Paragraph 107. Before the defendant had finished speaking, a crowd began to gather at the Capitol. Thereafter, a mass of people, including individuals who had traveled to Washington and to the Capitol at the defendant's direction, broke through the barriers, cordoning off the Capitol grounds, and advanced on the building, including by violently attacking law enforcement officers trying to secure it. 108. The defendant, who had returned to the White House after concluding his remarks, watched the events at the Capitol unfold on the television in the dining room next to the Oval Office. Food, chairs, televisions. That's what he's after. 109. At 2:13 p.m., after more than an hour of steady, violent advancement, the crowd at the Capitol broke into the building. Upon receiving news that individuals had breached the Capitol, the defendant's advisors told him that there was a riot there and that rioters had breached the building. When advisors urged the defendant to issue a calming message aimed at the rioters, the defendant refused, instead repeatedly remarking that the people at the Capitol were angry because the election had been stolen. 111. At 2:24 p.m., after advisors had left the defendant alone in his dining room, the defendant issued a tweet intended to further delay and obstruct the certification. Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution. giving states a chance to certify a corrected set of facts, not the fraudulent or inaccurate ones they were asked to previously certify. USA demands the truth. Paragraph 112, 1 minute later, at 2:25 p.m., the United States Secret Service was forced to evacuate the vice president to a secure location. 1:13, at the Capitol, throughout the afternoon, members of the crowd chanted, "Hang Mike Pence." "Where is Pence? Bring him out." And "Traitor Pence." Paragraph 114, the defendant repeatedly refused to approve a message directing rioters to leave the Capitol, as urged by his most senior advisors, including the White House counsel, a deputy White House counsel, the chief of staff, a deputy chief of staff, and a senior advisor. Instead, the defendant issued 2 tweets that did not ask rioters to leave the Capitol, but instead falsely suggested that the crowd at the Capitol was being peaceful, including A, at 2:38 p.m., "Please support our Capitol Police and law enforcement. They are truly on the side of our country. Stay peaceful." They weren't peaceful, but stay peaceful. Okay. And B, at 3:13 p.m., "I am asking for everyone at the U.S. Capitol to remain peaceful. No violence. Remember, we are the party of law and order. Respect the law and our great men and women in blue. Thank you." But they had already beat them over the head with fire extinguishers. So, too late. Paragraph 115, at 3 p.m., the defendant had a phone call with the minority leader of the United States House of Representatives. That's McCarthy, as you know. The defendant told the minority leader that the crowd at the Capitol was more upset about the election than the minority leader was. Remember? "Well, Kevin, I guess these people are just more upset about the election than you." This is Kevin McCarthy calling and saying, "You got to call this off. These people are crazy. They're threatening everybody. They're pounding at my office. They might kill my staff and me. Call them off." "Well, Kevin, they're just more upset than you are." Paragraph 116. At 4:17 p.m., the defendant released a video message on Twitter that he had just taped at the White House Rose Garden. In it, the defendant repeated the knowingly false claim that, quote, "we had an election that was stolen from us," and finally asked individuals at last to leave the Capitol while telling them that they were very special and that we love you. Paragraph 117. After the 4:17 p.m. tweet, the defendant joined others in the outer Oval Office to watch the attack on the Capitol on television. The defendant said, "See, this is what happens when they try to steal an election. These people are angry. These people are really angry about it. This is what happens." At 6:01 p.m., the defendant tweeted, "These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from great patriots who have been badly and unfairly treated for so long. Go home with love and in peace. Remember this day forever." Remember it in contemporaneous notes and testify against me. All right. Paragraph 119. On the evening of January 6th, the defendant and co-conspirator 1, Rudy, attempted to exploit the violence and chaos at the Capitol by calling lawmakers to convince them, based on knowingly false claims of election fraud, to delay the certification, including A, the defendant, through White House aides, attempted to reach 2 United States senators at 6 p.m. From 6:59 p.m. until 7:18 p.m., Rudy placed calls to 5 United States senators and 1 United States representative. C, co-conspirator 6 attempted to confirm phone numbers for 6 United States senators whom the defendant had directed co-conspirator 1 to call and attempt to enlist in further delaying the certification. D, in one of the calls, co-conspirator 1 left a voicemail intended for a United States senator that said, "We need you, our Republican friends, to try to just slow it down so we can get these legislatures to get more information to you. And I know they're reconvening at 8 tonight, but the only strategy we can follow is to object to numerous states and raise issues so that we get ourselves into tomorrow, ideally until the end of tomorrow." Again, working under the weird theory that if it doesn't happen on January 6th, it can't happen legally at all. And subparagraph E, in another message intended for another United States Senator, co-conspirator 1, repeated knowingly false allegations of election fraud, including that the vote counts certified by the states to Congress were incorrect, and that the governors who had certified knew they were incorrect. That illegal immigrants had voted in substantial numbers in Arizona, and that Georgia gave you a number in which 65,000 people who were underage voted. New one. Co-conspirator 1 also claimed that the vice president's actions had been surprising and asked the senator to, quote, object to every state and kind of spread this out a little bit like a filibuster. Paragraph 120. At 7:01 p.m., while co-conspirator 1 was calling the United States senators on behalf of the defendant, the White House counsel called the defendant to ask him to withdraw any objections and allow the certification. The defendant refused. 121. The attack on the Capitol obstructed and delayed the certification for approximately 6 hours until the Senate and House of Representatives came back into session separately at 8:06 and 9:02 p.m. respectively, and came together as a joint session at 11:35 p.m. 122. At 11:44 p.m., co-conspirator 2 emailed the vice president's counsel, advocating that the vice president violate the law and seek further delay of the certification. Co-conspirator 2 wrote, I implore you to consider one more relatively minor violation of the Electoral Count Act and adjourn for 10 days to allow the legislatures to finish their investigations, which weren't underway at all, as well as to allow a full forensic audit, whatever that might even mean, of the massive amount of illegal activity that has occurred here. 123. At 3:41 a.m. on January 7th, as President of the Senate, the Vice President announced the certified results of the 2020 presidential election in favor of Biden. Paragraph 124. Remember, that's 3:41 a.m. on January 7th. So they have delayed things until January 7th, but it's of no interest to anybody and of no avail. It's just happened later, but so what? What the act requires is that they meet at 1 p.m. on January 6th. It doesn't say how long it can take them to get through the process. I don't think anybody ever bothered to look at that on Team Trump, but whatever. So, let's see. So now paragraph 123, right, says it's all done at 3:41 a.m. on January 7th. 124, the defendant and his co-conspirators committed one or more of the acts to effect the object of the conspiracy alleged in the above paragraphs, and they basically list paragraphs from paragraph 13 all the way through, skipping a few of them, but basically all of what we just said means that the defendant had co-conspirators and they committed all of these acts. It has to be stated. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Everybody sees what's happening here. We're winding up actually all of this nonsense, and it's been like 3-4 different shows that we've been reading this across. I wonder if I should just pick out those things and edit it all together and make one indictment reading special for people. Oh, now I've made more work for myself. But all of this is finally bringing us to the end of count 1. And remember, there's 4 counts in all of this? Oh, I need the Sesame Street sound effect of I have lightning and thunder, right? I can use the hard dramatic, but then I have to stop it abruptly. 4. Is it 4? It is 4. I better go check before I do this thing. 3, count 4. Yeah, 4 wonderful counts. Then we can just stop it there, but okay, well, never mind. We'll let the music play out. Oh, then we'll do it again. Okay, no, we won't. So, anyway, at this point, now this is the very tail end of the thing. We're almost done here, but what all of this is a reminder that all of this has been, that whole narrative, almost the whole narrative is, well, that's what count 1 involves. And, some of the paragraphs that get left out would be like paragraph, what was it that we were reading? Where, was it 105 or something like that, where he just says, oh, by the way, all of those things I told you, all of the defendant and the co-conspirators did all of them. That's sort of the reminder that this is not just a narrative of what happened. This is an indictment. And while this narrative is not necessarily required in order to do this. This is where, okay, we are doing a speaking indictment. We want everyone to know exactly, pretty much what we know and what we're going to lay out at trial and what the case actually is all about. But there are a few things that are necessary to actually turn this short story into an indictment. And one of them is the sorts of thing that we heard in the very short paragraph 105, that after telling the whole story, it says, during and after the defendant's remarks, thousands of people marched toward the Capitol. Right. We need to know that in order to have context, but also the court needs to know that in terms of why we are indicting this president. These people then went and did this thing. They marched to the Capitol. Right. So that was in paragraph 105. But when they're actually laying out the charge and completing the count, section or paragraph 105 doesn't appear in the list. The defendant and his co-conspirators committed one or more of the acts to effect the object of the conspiracy alleged above in paragraphs 13, 15, and 16, 18 through 22, 24, 26, 28, 30 to 33, 35, 37 to 39, 41. You get the idea. It's like this, selectively, paragraphs. They don't say 105 because if you were reading this, the defendant and his co-conspirators committed one or more of the acts to effect this conspiracy, including paragraph 105, that at that point people marched to the Capitol. Yes, he directed them to march to the Capitol, but the fact that they marched to the Capitol at that point isn't actually part of the conspiracy. The conspiracy was to get them to march to the Capitol. That they actually did it is evidence that the conspiracy, was effected and worked, but it isn't part of the count. Now, count 2. And now the counts get shorter because you don't have to necessarily recite everything all over again. But paragraph 125 is the first part of count 2, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, 18 U.S. Code section 1512K. The allegations contained in paragraphs 1 through 4 and 8 through 123 of this indictment are realleged and fully incorporated here by reference. You don't have to list them again. You don't have to retell them. You just say, look above. Here are the ones we're saying are the key elements of count 2. And in this case, it's interesting. Yeah. Now that I think about it, the count 2, which is the conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding. What did they actually call count 1? Now that I have to think about it. But, boy, that's all the way up. No, the conspiracy to defraud the United States. Okay. So for some reason, paragraph 105, where the people actually march to the Capitol, doesn't have to do with the conspiracy to defraud the United States, but it is incorporated into count 2, which, I got to scroll back down to it now, is conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding. The crowd has a role in that. So that count includes paragraph 105. In fact, everything from 8 through 123. So interesting. So that's all realleged and fully incorporated by reference. That just means that's, terminology that means, count 2 is hereby deemed to include all of the foregoing paragraphs. Then 126, from on or about November 14th, 2020 through on or about January 7th, 2021 in the District of Columbia and elsewhere, the defendant, separately centered, alone in the line and in bold, Donald J. Trump, did knowingly combine, conspire, confederate, and agree with co-conspirators known and unknown to the grand jury to corruptly obstruct and impede an official proceeding, that is, the certification of the electoral vote in violation of Title 18 United States Code, Section 1512C2, in violation of Title 18 United States Code, Section 1512K. Got it? Okay. Count 3. That's all there is because we don't have to go through the whole narrative again. Obstruction of and attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, 18 U.S. Code, Sections 1512C2 and what? 2. C2, 2. That's what C2 and 2. All right. Got it. The allegations contained in paragraph 1 through 4 and 8 through 123, just like the other one, of this indictment are realleged, and fully incorporated here by reference. Yes, that you have to say again. Paragraph 128, from on or about November 14th, 2020, through on or about January 7th, 2021, in the District of Columbia and elsewhere. And again, that goes to his motion to have the trial relocated so that I can get a fair, that is to say, white jury that supports me. No, I'm sorry, that's a very extraordinary request because this happened in the District of Columbia, and that's where you should stand trial. But at that time, in the District of Columbia and elsewhere, the defendant, Donald J. Trump, attempted to and did corruptly obstruct and impede an official proceeding, that is, the certification of the electoral vote, in violation of Title 18 U.S. Code Sections 1512 C.2.2. Ba-boom. Got it? Count 4, conspiracy against rights, 18 U.S. Code Section 241. Paragraph 129 says the allegations contained in paragraphs 1 through 4 and 8 through 123 of this indictment are, everyone say it, re-alleged and fully incorporated here by reference. Finally, paragraph 130, from on or about November 14th, 2020, through on or about January 20th, 2021, in the District of Columbia and elsewhere. That's different, right? Instead of through January 7th, this one's through January 20th. The defendant, Donald J. Trump, did knowingly combine, conspire, confederate, and agree with co-conspirators known and unknown to the grand jury to injure, oppress, threaten, and intimidate one or more persons in the free exercise and enjoyment of a right and privilege secured to them by the Constitution and laws of the United States, that is, the right to vote and to have one's vote counted, in violation of Title 18 United States Code Section 241. And that's it. That's the entirety of it. There is some text that follows. For instance, a true bill. In other words, now attesting that this is in fact the indictment as handed up, as they say, or as they used to say anyway, by the grand jury, signed by the foreperson of the jury, though the signature is not here in this copy. This is a copy provided by Jack Smith, I guess, to the New York Times, though it is and does bear the signature of Jack Smith, Special Counsel, United States Department of Justice. That's that. Got it. You have had the entirety of the indictment in this case read to you and discussed along the way. We're done. But that only leaves time now for, or gives us the opportunity to move on to another long-term or long-form read that I started yesterday. This switches directions entirely, but so maybe we'll take a short break from the long reads, but I want to head back to the Loudoun County case, and the retelling of it and the reinvestigate, the second look at it, I guess, that the New York Times gave to the various controversies surrounding the Loudoun County School Board and the protests against their various policies and the mishmash of those policies themselves in the heads of the protesters, etc. But I thought I might add to the retelling of this by adding some of what's in the news at the moment that I think will help clarify some things, but I got to identify which ones are which. There's this. And maybe here I can start with the news from, or what I have is some from The Hill, which we don't necessarily love all that much as a source, but we do use it all the time because they're very aggressive in marketing their materials. I got there in the email, their morning report. Can I view it online? Yes. Okay, we can look at it that way so I can give you a link to it later on. Let's park it in Pocket. The Hill's morning report, a compilation by a couple of their reporters on everything that they're covering, of consequence, top headlines of the day. But this goes to the motions being made, pretrial motions being made by both sides in the January 6th case here in D.C. Lawyers say DOJ, that is Trump's lawyers say, DOJ wants to, quote, censor Trump. Well, let's get right to it and read their narrative on it. You've heard the story, but this is some organized thoughts on it. Former President Trump and his lawyers on Monday accused the Justice Department of proposing to censor his rights to be able to publicly disclose evidence, including witness information, in the government's case against him in the 2020 election conspiracy case. It's a weird thing. Of course, pre-trial, there'll be, the two sides will be exchanging all the information that they have about the charges. The government will be disclosing to the defense what evidence it has so that they can prepare adequately for trial. But in the normal case, that happens all the time. But what usually happens is the defendants are worried about being convicted and doing jail time, for one thing, and the defendants' lawyers are worried about being sanctioned by the courts, or another way is getting in trouble or blowing their client's case by violating the rules against disclosing the information that's shared with them by the prosecution in ways that would be prejudicial to the government's case, or that would taint the jury pool, or that could be used as witness intimidation, etc. And you're usually understood to be under orders not to disclose this material and to conduct a public relations campaign to try to affect the outcome of the trial. But that's all Trump ever does, whether it's in litigation or otherwise, and the government knows it, and they're trying to keep a lid on it. And Trump is taking advantage of the fact that this is sort of an unprecedented situation, and that courts will be loath to do what they might do with another defendant who just constantly violates this rule or violates any explicit orders, either gag them or imprison them, holding them in contempt pre-trial so that they don't keep blabbing. But Trump knows full well what sorts of problems are presented by a federal district court judge ordering the former president, who has still got Secret Service protection, arrested and thrown in jail to keep him from speaking. And of course, the fact that he's a declared presidential candidate, he declared early so that he could use this dodge. But you're telling me that the courts are allowed to gag presidential candidates in the middle of a campaign? Well, it's not really the middle of a campaign. You're pretending it's the middle of the campaign, and there's no formal rules about when the campaign begins, so maybe you even have a claim here. All right, so here's what's going on. Trump wants modifications to the judges, or what the judge is being asked to do by the prosecution. He wants modifications to the rules that will govern his communications pre-trial. But he's also exploiting his supporters' belief that President Biden's Justice Department is targeting the former president for political gain. Bottom line, as these reporters here say it, the back and forth that has begun with procedural legal exchanges early in the government's case foreshadows a never-give-an-inch political throwdown ahead. The thicket of Trump's legal woes in at least 2 states and the nation's capital ensures that few Americans are likely to closely track the details of legal filings, but voters are forming opinions well ahead of a trial. Trump's allies in the media immediately referred to the Justice Department's efforts to secure a protective order, that is, again, trying to restrict what he can do or what he can say, because they know how he uses his words. Trump is here saying, well, I'm a presidential candidate. You can't restrict what I have to say. First Amendment, et cetera, which you'd have a point about if it wasn't also demonstrated that, well, what you use your First Amendment speech for is to intimidate witnesses and personally attack people who are themselves exercising First Amendment rights. But since you're no longer the government, maybe it's okay. Trump's allies are trying to fight against this protective order that the Justice Department is looking for. They want their witnesses protected. They want their prosecutors protected. They want everybody protected from attacks and death threats. But they say it would, they assert, Trump's lawyers, that any restrictions could violate Trump's First Amendment rights. Some backers predicted the former president, known for speaking first and worrying about the consequences later, might ignore restrictions imposed by U.S. District Judge Tanya Chutkan in Washington, D.C. So And of course, I think that they're going to try and do that because it essentially sets up this way. Can a federal district court judge, and remember that's kind of the lowest rung of the federal court system, say, look, I told you, I warned you, you ignored it, and now you're being held in contempt of court and you're ordered to jail pending trial. Well, that's it. For a normal defendant, yeah, they would absolutely do that. For the Secret Service guarded former president of the United States now running for president, well, basically they're saying, we want to see whether you have the guts to do it. But I mean, the judge, I don't know, maybe the judge should have the guts to do it and just say, well, what's the worst that can happen, right? I order you to jail. The DC Circuit could reverse me. The Supreme Court could reverse me, I guess. But I mean, I get reversed. They don't chop my hands off. But of course, she also has to kind of calculate, well, if I am reversed on this, they're going to make hay out of that for sure. You see, we told you that this was a political persecution of Trump, trying to stop him from being able to run for president. And you said it was based on something else. But the Supreme Court, that neutral arbiter of everything, says you're wrong. It really was political. Well, they didn't say it was political. They just said that it may be, they might end up just saying, well, under the circumstances is improper, or it creates more of a headache than it's worth. And you can just properly penalize the defendant at trial in evidentiary rulings later on, I suppose, if that's the better outcome. I don't think it would be necessarily, but, she has to be aware that this could be turned into a political haymaking operation. Plus, of course, it would end up resulting in death threats against her, but she's going to get those regardless. So back to the morning report here. Special counsel Jack Smith and his team last week sought a protective order, citing in part Trump's history, as we were saying, of posting on social media about witnesses, judges, attorneys, and others associated with the case against him, including a post last week that said, all the caps, if you go after me, I'm coming after you. Depends what you think that means, right? Prosecutors said they sought the order so they could immediately turn over evidence in the case. Again, part of the protective order, right? Don't disclose evidence in a prejudicial way that we're sharing with you because we're required to do so because you're under criminal indictment. The New York Times has got a report that they point to here. That whole thing, by the way, the if you go after me, I'm coming after you, and the protective order, summarized by the Washington Post's report. Trump lawyers, they've changed it. The headline now reads, fight over the Trump January 6th secrecy order marks start of race to trial. Further noted in the roundup here in the New York Times, reporting on what to know about the prosecutor's request for a protective order, which envisions that the defense in general uses discovery evidence, only to pursue actions related to the case itself and not to release it widely. We don't think that that's really true, but let's see. The prosecutors want a protective order, and I see what they mean. They were seeking a protective order because usually a normal defendant's defense would use evidence only to prepare for the case, not to release it to the public in order to try to, accomplish some end. Most often the worry is that they're attempting to poison the jury pool with that. And that goes to the questions Ricky was asking yesterday. But I guess I would remind you, my answer to that, the way I theorize about that is the only thing Trump is really entitled to, he's not entitled necessarily at the outset. In the end, he can appeal on these grounds, and he probably would. But at the outset, it's not actually the case that you're entitled to a non-biased jury pool. They can't guarantee the absence of all bias, but you are entitled to a jury that says it can consider the case fairly, despite all the negative publicity or the witness tampering or whatever they think is going on. They will be asking them, the only way they can satisfy the test that you're entitled to an untainted jury pool is to ask them, well, are you an untainted jury pool? Your Honor, they look her in the eye. Yes, I am. Right? Okay. well, then we take your word for it. Now, other people could choose not to believe you, and they could litigate further or appeal on the basis that they thought you were lying. But the only thing that will be entered into evidence is the judge asked them, are you unbiased? And they said yes. And unless there's other solid evidence that's admissible that demonstrates the contrary, there won't be anything presented to an appeals court to with which to dispute the juror's conclusion that they can be unbiased. So keep that in mind. All right. Let's see. So, right. The New York Times piece here. And what's the title of that piece? Maybe we'll provide all of that to you as well. What to know about prosecutors' request for a protective order on the January 6th case. We probably should read you the piece, but then we won't get to the other stuff. So we'll take the Hill's summary of it and just remind you that the reason that they're asking for it is they understand that Trump's defense and the lawyers executing that defense are very different from normal defense attorneys and normal defendants, and are going to use the pretrial disclosure in a very different way than most defendants ever will. In a 29-page filing, Trump's lawyers argued that the government's proposal was overbroad and instead asked Judge Chutkan to adopt a revised order to shield only genuinely sensitive materials from public view. The government, they say, requests the court assume the role of censor and impose content-based regulations on President Trump's political speech that would forbid him from publicly discussing or disclosing all non-public documents produced by the government, including both purportedly sensitive material and non-sensitive, potentially exculpatory documents. Chutkan had required responses from prosecutors and Trump's lawyers by 5 p.m. Monday. The Justice Department, reacting to Trump's proposal to ease the government's proposed restrictions on public disclosures of shared evidence, pushed back in its response within hours on Monday night. It shows how far apart the two sides remain and how aggressively the government wants to drive the pace of prosecution as Trump's legal team tries to tap the brakes. And they say here, prosecutors are responding, the defendant seeks to use the discovery material to litigate this case in the media, prosecutors responded, but that is contrary to the purpose of criminal discovery, which is to afford defendants the ability to prepare for and mount a defense in court, not to wage a media campaign. Meanwhile, Trump is lashing out at former Vice President Mike Pence, who could become a witness for the prosecution based on conversations with Trump leading up to the January 6, 2021 Electoral College certification in the U.S. Capitol. And the riot there, that they don't mention for some reason. Pence has contemporaneous notes and was interviewed by investigators and is harshly critical of Trump, but says he does not believe the former president's actions amounted to felonies, in the hope, I guess, that would save him from Trump's wrath, but it doesn't look like that's going to work. But if he's going to be a witness in the case and Trump attacks him personally over time or sends death threats his way, how is that distinguishable from run-of-the-mill witness tampering or witness intimidation? It's very difficult to try and come up with a reason why that's different. All right. Just before the break, then, maybe we'll throw in reading from a related piece that we were holding on to. Where can we do this one? Where can we find this one? There we are. The Washington Post on August 4th. Spencer Hsu, Carol Leonig, and Tom Jackman together on a piece just, for background. If Trump is convicted or if he's found in contempt pre-trial, for instance, Secret Service protection may be obstacle to imprisonment. Of course, we've all wondered what would happen about that. Donald Trump can keep Secret Service protection for life, even if he were to be convicted and sentenced to prison or home confinement. So that's an option to think about too, which isn't much of a confinement considering what his homes are like. But maybe they could find a really crappy home that he still owns and send him there. If convicted in any of the 3 criminal cases he's facing, or the 4th, Donald Trump may be able to influence whether he goes to prison and what his stay there looks like under a law that allows former U.S. presidents to keep Secret Service protection for life, some current and former U.S. officials said. And once again, this is another law that was designed without the idea in mind there might be a rogue criminal former president. It just really wasn't contemplated. Presidents since 1965 have been afforded lifetime protection. Since then, only Richard Nixon has waived it as a cost-saving move for taxpayers 11 years after his resignation. But he didn't feel like his life was under threat because, I don't know, I guess Democrats don't do that stuff for whatever reason. But unless he follows Nixon's example, which he never would, Trump could force politically and logistically complex questions over whether officials should detail agents to protect a former American president behind bars, leave it to prison authorities to keep him safe, or secure him under some type of home confinement, former U.S. officials said. Could Trump face prison? Theoretically, yes, and practically no, said Chuck Rosenberg, a former top federal prosecutor and counsel to then FBI Director James Comey. Rosenberg served briefly as head of the Drug Enforcement Administration in the Trump administration and notably said the president had condoned police misconduct in remarking to officers in Long Island they need not protect suspects' heads when loading them into vehicles. Hi everybody, it's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and patreon.com, Patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, Patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Jumping back into the Washington Post's exploration of the question of what impact does the Secret Service protection for Donald Trump have on the ability to imprison him were he to be convicted in any one of these cases, or in fact, I should throw out there, imprisoned prior to trial or during trial for contempt orders as well. So, as we left off, we heard from Chuck Rosenberg, formerly head of the DEA in the Trump administration and a former federal prosecutor, counsel to James Comey when he was FBI director, and the guy who apparently, notably, as we were running out of time at the end of the break, notably had said that the president, that being Trump, had condoned police misconduct when he made his infamous remark while at remarking to officers in Long Island, I guess at a rally or something. You don't have to protect the suspect's head when loading them into police vehicles. They're too gentle. In my day, they used to rough them up. You remember all that? Now, notice that he doesn't call for that sort of treatment when he's being indicted and arrested. Nobody should be knock the hell out of them, rough them up, good. That'll keep them in line. Nobody has so far advocated that. Not that I would turn away from such advocacy. Maybe he learns a lesson that way. Could be a teaching moment. Anyway, Rosenberg continues here. Any federal district judge ought to understand it raises enormous and unprecedented logistical issues. Rosenberg said of the prospect that Trump could be incarcerated, probation, fines, community service, and home confinement are all alternatives. Bottom of the ocean is also an alternative. Look, it's extraordinarily harsh, but maybe they should charge him with treason just to solve this problem. Well, if we execute him, we don't have to give him Secret Service protection. Now, that would be an interesting question. What does the Secret Service do if you're actually all under due process of law, everything by the books? You are tried with a capital crime, found guilty, and sentenced to death. Do they stop the execution because they're the Secret Service and you're going to, quote unquote, kill the president? Or do they get out of the way because it's a judicially mandated, state-endorsed killing? I don't know. There's no real answer to that one. But again, because nobody ever contemplated it, even though Aaron Burr was tried for treason. Well, okay. Anyway, Trump is now facing 3 separate criminal cases, soon to be 4, I guess, with the prospect of at least one more on the horizon. There it is. He has a pending March trial date in a New York State fraud case. He was charged by Special Counsel Jack Smith in federal court in Florida, over the handling of the classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. In federal court in D.C., Smith's team alleges Trump conspired to subvert the results of the election. He could soon be charged in Georgia on similar allegations. The charges Trump faces technically come with the possibility of decades in prison, though pleas, verdicts, and possible punishments are very far off. Mary McCord, who served as we forgot to use our recording here, served as Assistant Attorney General for National Security during President Barack Obama's administration and led the department for the first several months under Trump, said Trump presents unique challenges to the Justice Department. Ensuring some penalty for a former president under Secret Service detail would require extensive discussions and potential accommodations because it really would be a pretty enormous burden on our prison system to have to incarcerate Donald Trump. Well, put him on island then. Reopen Alcatraz. The question is an open one at the U.S. Secret Service. Asked whether a former president who does not waive protection can be incarcerated, agency spokesman Anthony Guglielmi said, the Secret Service does not have comment or response, only because there is no such policy or procedure that currently exists. We won't have any further comment. Added Marcia Espinoza, spokeswoman for the Secret Service's parent agency, the Department of Homeland Security. They used to be in Treasury, but I guess, they transferred them when they created Homeland Security. Former and current Secret Service agents said that while there is no precedent, they feel certain the agency would insist on providing some form of 24/7 protection to an imprisoned former president. And they say the agency is probably planning for that possibility, seeking to match to some degree its normal practice of rotating 3 daily shifts of at least 1 or 2 agents providing close proximity protection. The question keeps getting raised, yet no official answers from the Secret Service, said Jonathan Wackrow, a former Secret Service agent and now Chief Operating Officer for Teneo, a corporate advisory and communications firm. However, we can infer how security measures could be implemented based on existing protective protocols. Unless there are changes in legislation, which they should think about, or the former president waives protection, the U.S. Secret Service would likely maintain a protective environment around the president in accordance with their current practices. Current and former agents said Trump's detail would coordinate their protection work with the Federal Bureau of Prisons to ensure that there was no conflict about duties or about how they would handle emergencies, as well as the former president's routine movements in a prison, such as heading to exercise or meals. Well, don't worry about him heading to exercise, but you probably have to double up the detail on meals. The Secret Service, they said, would maintain a bubble around Trump in any case, keeping him at a distance from other inmates. In some ways, protection may be easier. The absence of travel means logistics get easier, and confinement means that the former president's location is always known, Wackrow said. Theoretically, the perimeter is well fortified. No one is worried about someone breaking into jail. The Justice Department's Bureau of Prisons declined to say whether former presidents with Secret Service protection could be incarcerated, or to comment on circumstances of a possible Trump designation. However, a spokesman said general factors can include the level of security an inmate requires, any health needs, proximity to their release locations, and separation and security measures to ensure the inmate's protection. The Bureau has had to handle VIP inmates in the past, though minimum security camps often have dormitory-style housing. Another agency official said it was in a position similar to the Secret Service, lacking a policy or procedure. What would sentencing look like? That's another section here. The prospect of potentially decades in prison for Trump is politically loaded, though the charges he faces could carry such a penalty. After entering a not guilty plea in Miami federal court on June 13th, Trump claimed he was being threatened with 400 years in prison, adding up the statutory maximum penalties for the 37 counts against him. The charges he faces in D.C., related to his alleged efforts to stay in power despite losing the election, could add additional decades based on that math. Judges almost never apply maximum penalties to first offenders, first offender, oh boy, and rarely stack sentences rather than let them run concurrently. However, federal sentencing guidelines are highly technical. Specialists estimate that a first offender convicted of multiple counts of willfully retaining national defense information and obstructing or conspiring to obstruct an investigation by concealing evidence might face a range of anything from 51 to 63 months on the low end, about 5 years, to 17.5 to 22 years on the high end, or about 20 years given Trump's alleged leadership role and abuse of trust. Similarly, January 6th riot defendants convicted at trial of 2 of the same counts with which Trump is charged, conspiring to or actually obstructing an official proceeding, have faced sentencing guideline ranges as high as 7 to 11 years and as low as less than 2 years. But judges always have the final say. Without question, if it were anyone else but Trump, prison would be a certainty, said Thomas A. Durkin, a former federal prosecutor who teaches national security law at Loyola University, Chicago. However, he said, the Secret Service waiver issue is a novel and complex issue that could theoretically factor into an exception. The Justice Department has mounted at least a dozen investigations into the removal or unlawful retention of classified information since 2005. Pentagon employees, contractors, and people employed by the FBI, CIA, National Security Agency, etc. have all been convicted and sentenced to prison. Among the most recent, former contractor Harold Martin was convicted in 2019 and is serving a 9-year prison term for taking home a huge number of hard and digital copies of classified materials, the equivalent of 500 million pages. And former FBI analyst Kendra Kingsbury was recently sentenced to nearly 4 years in prison after taking home more than 300 documents, including materials relating to Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. But other high-ranking U.S. officials who pleaded guilty got probation, including President Bill Clinton's former National Security Advisor Sandy Berger in 2005 and retired U.S. Army General David Petraeus, a former CIA director, in 2015. Berger admitted to concealing and removing 5 copies of a classified document from the National Archives and was ordered to pay a $50,000 fine and give up his security clearance for 3 years. Petraeus was sentenced to 2 years of probation and fined $100,000 following revelations that he shared some materials with his biographer and lover. My oh my, same person, not 2 people. Acceptance of a plea deal is a crucial consideration. In the only case of an American president or vice president to be convicted of a crime, U.S. prosecutors involved in the federal bribery prosecution that led to Vice President Spiro Agnew's resignation in 1973 said prison time never became an issue because he entered a plea deal. It was clear from the very beginning that there would be no deal if he had to go to jail, recalled Russell T. Baker, Jr., former Maryland U.S. attorney. We in the department debated with Attorney General Elliot Richardson whether or not we should insist on a jail term, but Agnew and his lawyers kept saying, and we believed them, there would be no deal then, so it never really rose as an issue, Baker said. Agnew, a former Maryland governor, received 3 years probation and a $10,000 fine after agreeing to enter a plea to a criminal tax felony for failing to report hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes and kickbacks he received as a county executive. U.S. prosecutors have charged more than 300 people with obstructing Congress's certification of the election. Actually, you know all of this. And, so basically everybody else faces prison, but maybe he doesn't. What are the complications of confinement? Let's get to that. While it is unusual, the complexity of the conditions of confinement could have an impact on the sentence a judge imposes, said Nancy Gertner, retired federal judge and Harvard Law School professor. Gertner cited a body of law that allows a judge to consider whether a frail defendant, you'd have to cop to that, a frail defendant might be subject to abuse in prison, and a case in which she recognized that a non-U.S. citizen would not qualify for programs such as drug or mental health treatment. Unlike Berger and Petraeus, whose crimes appear to be one-offs, Trump is accused of a much more sustained problem, she said. Good point. On the other hand, there are political considerations and the uniqueness of the case, she added. Gertner said the Secret Service has handed off security duties in the past, such as when former First Lady Hillary Clinton was protected by State Department security as Secretary of State. The Secret Service can direct and oversee protection by others. That's a good point. That may be a way out. Assigning a special detail to work inside the Bureau of Prisons, or potentially helping prison officials enforce a custodial sentence at home, potentially such as at Trump's Bedminster, New Jersey, or Mar-a-Lago residences, or elsewhere. Who knows how that would pan out, Gertner said. She added, I think the answer would be an accommodation could be made. The fact that there have been accommodations in the past for various situations suggest there could be accommodations now. So I guess it really could also include, I guess if they really pressed it, the Secret Service could say, we're satisfied that the Bureau of Prisons protects him just fine, and leave it at that. But I don't know that anybody would actually believe that. But there, I think there's a real possibility for something there, right? When Hillary Clinton was entitled to lifetime protection as a former first spouse, but was instead protected by State Department security while she was Secretary of State. Well, she was protected, yes, but that does represent the time during which the Secret Service felt just fine with foregoing the need to provide that protection itself. So if they were to become convinced that the Bureau of Prisons could protect him, or attest to that, even if they didn't really believe it, then presumably somebody could rubber stamp, so a judge could say, yeah, all right, well, if you think that they're up to it, then I'll take your word for it, and we'll just let him go to prison after all. But I just don't think that they would say such a thing. So, but the possibility exists. You got to throw it out there when you're investigating what's going on out in the weeds. Okay. Let's see. I told you that I wanted to return to the Loudoun County thing, although we now, have a lot less time to do it. But I kind of wanted to continue on because things were really starting to get interesting, and we were getting to the part of the story where the new information that has emerged since the controversy exploded, particularly the controversy over the sexual assaults, the rape that occurred in the Loudoun County schools in Stone Ridge, I think, high school, that led to the confrontation at the school board meeting that resulted in Scott Smith's arrest. And the conflation of the issues, not just with CRT and masking and COVID issues, but the conflation of issues around Smith's arrest and having been escorted out of the school building when he initially responded to the reports of his daughter's rape. It was used to drum up passions, or to inflame passions and drum up opposition among conservative activists. The usual play. They're doing this to me because I'm conservative. Or a father is responding to an attack on his daughter like any good father would. He is going to be outraged, and you treated me like a terrorist. Well, it turns out that there's kind of good explanations. If you follow things step by step and go through the process of what happened and the logistics of what happened, it begins to make a certain amount of sense. But when we left off, we had just said, all right, well, there was also the complicating factor that while what happened here happened without the girl's consent and is therefore a rape, it's still the case that it wasn't what they were alleging it to be, in the hopes that they could use it to fight a culture war issue. That is, of transgender rights and the use of the bathroom that corresponds to your gender identity policy. That's what they hoped to undermine and attack by saying, we told you that transgender boys or boys transitioning to girls, we're going to use this policy to enter girls' bathrooms and to lie in wait for unsuspecting girls and sexually assault them. And now it has happened. Except that isn't what happened. One, he doesn't identify as transgender. Two, he didn't lie in wait for a random passerby. He arranged ahead of time with the girl's agreement to meet her in the bathroom, at least had done so before, and after which they had met and had sex. But this time he thought he was meeting her for the same, but she agreed to meet him in the same place and possibly for the same, but wasn't promising anything sexually that day. Okay, that's, that sets it apart. Absolutely. But is there evidence that undermines or in fact completely destroys the claim that conservatives hoped to make, that this was about sexual predation of transgender individuals lurking in the bathroom waiting for unknown victims? Yeah, that actually falls apart completely. So we understand what happened here. They meet. He forces sex on her, and that's horrible in its own right. But what happens next is they are discovered at that moment while he's in the middle of raping her, essentially. Actually, it's not an essential to it. At that moment, a teacher's assistant came into the bathroom and the boy jumped up. The woman would later testify that she saw 2 pairs of feet beneath the stall door, but thought little of it. Pairs of girls were often in a stall together. After she left, the boy forced the girl to, it's breakfast time, but, there was more sexual assault after that, and that, according to the girl, and they left the bathroom at the same time, and the girl went to the nurse's office because she knew, rightly, she had been sexually assaulted and sought help. Tavis Henry. Now, this is where, again, the conservative activists began to try to intentionally conflate what was going on with other issues and other battles, or not other issues, but to conflate to confuse people about what actually happened here and to make claims that X happened when it was really more nuanced than that. Tavis Henry, the sheriff's deputy who served as the school resource officer for Stonebridge, not Stone Ridge, but Stonebridge, had just begun to interview the girl because she had said, "Hey, I've been raped." And she was right. Okay, you need to talk to the school cops. There's a sheriff's deputy on site. The school knows that she needs to talk to him immediately. And that happens. He had just begun to interview the girl when her mother arrived, followed later by her father. All normal to this point, right? Scott Smith, that's the father, had an employee drive him to the school. Why is that important? You will see. Now, he arrives at the school. Someone else has driven him. That explains how it is that he arrives at the school without any identification on him. His driver's license is not with him. Now, I'm a Loudoun County school parent, or I was up until this past June anyway, and I know exactly what that means right off the bat. I know that for years I have not been able to enter any of the school buildings, whether it's to bring a forgotten textbook, laptop, lunch, pick up early for a doctor's appointment, etc., etc. I know that the only way into the school buildings now is to ring the intercom, the video intercom bell outside the school with, I'm instructed, my driver's license held up next to my face so that when the camera comes on, they get an image of me, my face, and my ID. Legible, image of my ID. And then they ask me, who am I? Why am I coming in there? And then they'll buzz me in if they feel it's appropriate. If you arrive without an ID, they say, we need you to hold your ID up. If you say, I don't have my ID, they're immediately sort of suspicious. Well, they could waive that, of course, if they recognize you or if they think something, well, this seems like a run-of-the-mill kind of thing. But a parent of a student showing up without any identification is an oddity because usually they've driven themselves to the school. Not the case here, right? Now you see how things are going to begin to snowball. Scott Smith had an employee drive him to the school, and he began shouting because his daughter has just been attacked. He began shouting when school staff denied him entrance because he didn't have his driver's license. Understandable, but understandable on both sides here, right? You need to show your ID. That's the rule, and it's been the rule for years. And you know that as a Loudoun County parent. You do. You absolutely know that. But on the other hand, consider the circumstance and consider the stress he's under. And you bureaucratic, my daughter. So you can see why he'd be upset. But what's happening here from the other perspective, from the training of the school staff, is that an unknown person, as far as they know, I mean, they might be expecting this girl's dad to show up, or the person who answers the door may have no idea whatsoever about what's happening to the girl. She may just be another office worker who has no idea that there's a girl in a nurse's office being interviewed by the school resource officer. But an irate man whom they cannot identify and who refuses to produce identification is demanding entry to the school. It's the very reason they have this security system. It's the very reason they have this rule, so that you don't have no alternative but just to let randos who are screaming at you into the building, because that looks like school shooter on the radar of a school employee who doesn't know anything else about what's going on, or even who does know what else is going on, but knows that you can only be admitted with ID. You may very well be the parent of a student who's been attacked. I just have to be able to prove it before I let you in, and you won't let me do it. And you immediately fly off the handle when I try to tell you I can't let you in without ID. But there's an accommodation reached. The school resource officer knows that a parent is probably coming and maybe overhears what's going on and says, well, you can't just buzz him in, but I'll tell you what, I'm the school resource officer. It's my responsibility to protect the students in here. I'll go out and I'll try to establish whether or not this is the girl's father, and then perhaps vouch for him and bring him in if that's the case, even though he doesn't have his ID. And I don't know why in the world he wouldn't have his ID, but I'll go find out. Right, reasonable. So when Tavis Henry, the deputy, goes out to meet him, Smith told me, the reporter writing this piece, that he told the officer, and again, now put yourself in the shoes of the officer. Well, I understand that it might be the dad. It might not be the dad. It could be a random weirdo trying to gain entrance to the school. I'll go check it out. The guy says to him, I'm coming through the door. And there's an expletive deleted here, but probably effing tackle me or escort me. Your choice. Like super aggressive, which again, he's under stress. I understand that he's freaked out about his daughter, that he's freaked out about the bureaucracy, but he is confronting a cop and he says, tackle me or escort me, your choice. Like, well, of course I would choose to escort you, but thanks for threatening me. Anyway, now when Smith met Flynn outside the main office, I've lost track of this. Flynn, the principal, perhaps. When he met Flynn outside the main office, he was enraged, very loud, Flynn testified in court. Again, understandable, right? He wanted to know where the boy was that had done this. Also understandable, but unwise, because we see what now begins to snowball again. Where's the boy? Why? What do you want to have a friendly chat with him? In all likelihood, it isn't outlined explicitly here, but in all likelihood, it's, where's the boy? I'll effing kill him. So now you have a person whose identity you haven't actually definitively established, demanding entry into the school, somehow brought into the school anyway, and immediately starts making possible threats of violence against the students and the student body. for all we know. At least one specific student. We cannot have this. And it snowballs further. He wanted to know where was the boy that had done this. He was acting aggressively enough toward Flynn that Henry, the police officer, placed himself between them. I was upset, Smith acknowledged. Sure, of course, but it doesn't excuse everything, right? Henry sees that things are getting out of control, calls for more deputies, and walked Smith out of the building. We've got a situation where I've had to insert myself physically between the principal and an irate somebody, maybe a parent, who wants to get physically a hold of one of the students here and do who knows what. Maybe he's morally justified in it, but we can't have this happening in the school building. You'll have to come outside with me, and I need backup because this guy is irate. That gets reported on Fox News and the Daily Wire, everywhere else, as his daughter was raped, and look what they did. They arrested him. Well, he burst into the school with no ID. They had to let him in eventually, and they asked him to calm down, and he won't, and he's physically threatening a student there, and at the same time, it's, it's not, I guess it's all in here eventually, but who knows how much time we have to get to it. But in the next couple of paragraphs for today's installment, we'll wind things up by saying they do note here that this is happening outside the main office, and there's students in the building, and all of those students are carrying smartphones, and they start thinking perhaps about milling about and maybe videoing this thing, and they start texting home. There's a weird rando guy in here, and he's threatening to kill a student. Now it starts to happen that the local community is getting leaks from inside in real time that make people think that there might be some sort of crazy act of violence happening. Nobody knows the background. That's not going out on social media. All they know is that a weird rando who came from work, who's a plumber, who may not be dressed in business attire, is being escorted out of the building. Police backup is showing up. They're screaming that he's violating my rights. To do what? To who? No one knows. But things are snowballing out of control. And that's what leads the school authorities at that point to send out a bulletin, a notice to all the parents to say there was an incident at the school today, but not the rape. That wasn't what they were talking about. What they were talking about was the one that leaked on social media, that a crazy guy had to get dragged out by the cops because he was threatening to kill a student there. They needed to get a lid on that. And that, too, gets played up by the right-wing media. They were all targeting him because he's conservative or because he's a concerned parent, as opposed to because what he was doing was leading to rumors circulating in the region that there was some sort of school violence underway. And there was.
From netrootsradio.com, you have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
Anyway, the rest of the story is equally incredible, and by the way, good point by the officer, who then says, well, now my full attention can't be on the investigation of the rape. My full attention is on the tamping down on the potential violence with this parent, and the whole point of my investigation has now been thwarted. Not my fault. We'll talk about it some more. Stay tuned.